You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast in association with Choose Health, and this is session 33. Welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast. I'm still Jack Chew, and we've been rather busy. We've had a number of things to catch you up on. First and foremost, this is going out in amongst a really busy period of time for us on social media, where we're plugging the hashtag Fill the Seats campaign, which is an idea that I came up with probably a couple of weeks back now, in which we're trying to fill the seats of the Rio Paralympics. If in case you haven't noticed on social media, this is something that's sort of taken off across in mainstream media as well. So if you haven't already, have a little look on crowdfunder.co.uk or on generosity.com and look for hashtag fill the seats. And $30 or sort of £22-ish will take a child of Rio out for the day, clothe them in merchandise, feed them and seat them in the stadium, and safely transport them back and forth from home. So this is something that we've worked on purely off an idea that's then taken shape and become a more formal plan with the Agitos Foundation, which is the official Paralympic charity, and we're working with the International Paralympic Committee to help with this. So you might have noticed it. If you haven't, then certainly check it out. Really appreciate your support for that. And so that's been taking up quite a bit of our time, but that's obviously not slowed us down. This is where I'm incredibly grateful as ever for the ever hard-working podcast team: Jack March, Rob Tyre, Danny Smart, Richard Barnes and Mark Reed. Of course, Charlotte Rattenbury, busy behind the scenes, all of them always working hard. And they've been able to turn this around, which is a podcast we had in the bank, really. It's the second part to our Pain podcast with Mick Thacker, past, present, and as you might have noticed later in the podcast, I can't say this. It's no, it's not. It's Pain, past, present, and future. Eventually got there. Another P to mention, which you'll get bored of hearing about potentially from our podcast, is Patreon, which is the website in which we're trying to become fan-funded and keep Physio Matters on the ground and working as it is. We're not making any threats to suggest that Physio Matters is going to fold. However, it will need to make some compromises on some of our output or the style in which we do things, or adverts or sponsors or other compromising variables that you might not want to influence our content or style of questioning. And if you don't, and if you feel you want exclusive content from us in which we can speak openly and candidly about difficult matters that exist amongst physiotherapy, then please do support us. Just a few pounds or dollars a month on patreon.com. It would be massively appreciated. We've already put some exclusive material on there, and we seem to be keeping all patrons happy. They're sticking with us for now, so we must be doing something right. So check us out on there. Now, the interview for this one, I've re-listened to it after 6 weeks where I haven't, and it is a real belter. I hope you enjoy it. Me and Mick Thacker start delving into some of the we finish off Physio Present, and we have some differences of opinion amongst that, which is good fun. And then we start to get our teeth into Physio Future, which is just an incredibly interesting piece of work that Mick's putting together with Andy Clark, and starts to discuss a little bit about where things are going with, or where he perceives things might start going with regards to predictive processing. So we talk about Mick's predictive processing predictions. So just in case you didn't know whether I was struggling enough with P's, then you certainly will do now. So I give you Mick Thacker and Pain, Past, Present and Future Part 2. I'll see you at the other side. Whilst we'd agree that that's the aim and the direction of travel, and if we could get people to think like that, then we'd be winning. But it is a bit utopian at the moment. People aren't doing that. People aren't going to the nitty gritty stuff, and they are kicking back against the science in replacement of supposed art, or they would just rather, especially while they're under very real pressures, especially something we discussed in our last podcast with the CSP, is about the general pressures on clinicians. And so as a means of kicking back against being busy, it's increasingly less likely that they're going to do the complex complex stuff and do the reading and really challenge themselves and fatigue themselves. So while that's not happening, if we're talking about physio and pain present, what is the way in which you would best translate that through then to patients, or suggest that clinicians do that?
I think you have to take information, from the patients. It's simply the first place to start. You have to understand and listen to what they've said, and you need to legitimize what they've said and then what they've heard. So, and being able to build a picture of that up. I mean, this would be much easier visually to do, but to take things like if I treat someone who's had back pain and they've been to see one specialist who tells them the disc, and the next one tells them it's a facet joint, the next that tells them the nerve. I've got to be able to demonstrate the relationship of all of those things and the interaction and potentially the interactive dynamics between those things that could explain why people might give them different viewpoints. So I want to bring that together, but that might look like an image that just focuses on the back. But obviously, I'd want to very quickly link that to a CNS, link that to a person. I would very much draw that person, and my drawing's not very good, so I'm very happy to suggest that I might be placing some fear on the part of people as soon as they see my art. But all joking aside, we want to incorporate that into a person. What I often see is people try and make an attempt at that, and they get back to our brain-bound thing. It has this bit of spine and then a brain with two lines going up, one going down rather, and just a brain and a back. And I've walked into clinical sort of settings all over the world where they've got a spine and they've got a brain, and that's all that's represented on there, as if those are the two things that are important. But then if you put a person on there and you listen to what they've been told, and you can start to put their thoughts and feelings on there, you can make it human, you can make it about the first person. You can demonstrate that you, in the third person, the person observing, has actually heard, listened, can reflect that back to someone and populate the person's experience for them. And I would use vision to do that primarily, with a few exceptions. If you pick up that visually is not the way that people communicate, but it would look like incorporating what's done. I'd have no interest in telling people I disagreed with what they'd heard before. I'd give no non-verbal suggestion, that tutting, raising eyebrows, look of horror and surprise, because in fact actually no one should be doing those things. And one, it's threatening and worrying. The second thing is, it's surprising to her that somebody with back pain, for example, has been given multiple diagnoses. That should not be shocking you if you're in any way up to date, or you reflect on your own experience, even if you don't have the time to do enough reading. Your own experience should show that actually most people with sort of ongoing sort of pain states, in, if you like, just say that's musculoskeletal, for example, it shouldn't come as any shock that people have been given multiple diagnoses or multiple reasons for that. But we've obviously then got to try and incorporate that into the understanding of the person, of themselves and their own position at that point in time.
So you'd find yourself integrating even diagnoses that you do find yourself disagreeing with. So you've spoken anatomically there, but let's say biomechanically, someone comes in with the typical pelvis out of alignment suggestion. I'd be surprised to hear you encompassing that, giving it some credit, and not necessarily countering it.
There's a huge difference, and I did a podcast with Adam, and it's something Meekins, and it's something he picked up on, and so same in a sense, good to have the same conversation, to clarify that to people, that to acknowledge that that's what someone's had, and to incorporate it into a schema where you start to demonstrate you've heard and that you understand is quite different from legitimizing it. What I would go on with that same diagram is I would give dependent on the person's, what I'm picking up from the person's, their where their worries are, where they're concerned most. So say that was in the periphery in the spine, that would get a number 1, and that would be part of my next session with them, would be to start with number 1 on that diagram. Do you sort of get what I'm saying? If it was the brain, it would be number 1. And then to look at sort of, put in a case then in a non-confrontational way of what is likely and unlikely to happen. What, I hate, particularly as a scientist who's also a clinician, to keep saying to people, we have evidence that shows, a paper shows, or to quote a paper to people. I don't do that.
No. I can.
It's a ridiculous thing to do. But because, and also it's trying to also, and many times it's because clinicians are unconfident in their knowledge. They don't have to sell it to a patient that researchers have shown. They are confident that if they really know their stuff, they can say that as a point of expert in that therapeutic relationship with that person in front of them. They don't have to resort to somebody else outside of that relationship of you as the therapist and them as the patient client. I hate those terms. As the person in front of you.
Yeah? The other human in the chat.
Now, so there's very much not a legitimization by incorporating it. But I always say to people who say, what, you just ignore it then? If you just ignore it because you don't want to legitimize it, then the person in front of you is not sure whether you've heard that or not. If you say, no, that's rubbish, or any milder form of that, you are on point 1, sort of showing you're going to disagree with that person, not a way to get them on side. It doesn't happen to happen. And this is the other thing about people going on courses and they, coming back and wanting to challenge everything the patient tells them, that you have to build up a therapeutic alliance with someone. Once you've done that, the part of that is to allow, as in any setting of communication, is to allow a toing and froing. And there's a beautiful paper by Carl Friston and Chris Frith that's called A Duet of One, and I would urge people to look at it. And actually it offers the neuroscience actually behind good communication. But you have to get into a point where people are going to listen and give and listen, and you can't do that within 10 minutes of meeting someone. No one can. So there's no point. Incorporate it first. It's not the same as legitimization. Know that that's something you may or may not want to deal with. How important is it to try and get across that the pelvis isn't out or not? In some people, that's essential. In others, you can work around that. It's not going to be a big issue once you've got that therapeutic alliance with someone.
Yeah, you identify its importance. Now I completely understand that, and I hadn't necessarily misunderstood that would be something you'd come to. But what you're describing there in terms of that drawing it out, talking it through, explaining and acknowledging every part of what that person has brought up. Now that's something that just doesn't strike me as being feasible with a list of 15 to 20 patients a day. Yeah, well, so can you understand why people find themselves cutting corners? Because it sounds like you might be frustrated by our temptation to find corners to cut.
Sorry, mate, I'm talking over you, and I don't mean to, but this is where you're getting my passions going. You made some reference to cause health. Did I or did I not make a clear and quite impassioned statement to any managers in the audience that the one thing that they are really perhaps guilty of is not giving particularly developing physiotherapists time to reflect on their practice, to clinically reason. I think anyone who's been on any course I've offered, or whatever level, for whatever reason, will have heard me make this statement that, in fact, actually, the pressures are so great, we shouldn't be surprised. We're not particularly good overall at doing these things well. We don't. This does tie in with your previous podcast, that really people are under so much pressure that they can't think, they can't reason. Even if they do know the stuff, it's actually difficult to really put into pressure. Yeah, any pain patient, and again, horrible terms, but anyone presenting with pain as a major aspect of their condition, the one thing that you need with them is time. You need to reduce tension. You need to give a sense of calm, not a sense of sort of, you're in and out. You need to move forward. So, I plead to all managers to look at how you actually allow people time. Again, back to just going back, I worked in what was a less pressured NHS, but it was still seemed to be pressured. But we still had time built in. When I was at St Stephen's and when I was at Chelsea and Westminster, we still had lots of time built into our lists where we weren't expected to be face to face with a patient, where we could actually, reflect and catch up if we needed to, or talk to colleagues. We'd have optional teaching sessions every morning, as well as, the timetabled in service. People wanted to come to work, wanted to learn, wanted to move forward. Not everyone, but the majority.
Yeah.
We've created this idea of just productivity, and in fact, actually, then we go back and we look at something like Start Back, and we know that when people have looked at some of the nice work that's come out of Keele with Start Back, is that lots of patients are being given inappropriate care, and when you do something about trying to stratify low back patients in this case and get them the right care, actually has hugely positive health economic costs, where people aren't being over-treated, where those with who are at low risk are sort of given advice and support and then left alone, so that you've got more time, if you like, if you're productivity driven, to just look at the sort of, medium and high risk patients. If we start to actually apply the right interventions to the right people at the right time, I actually think we'll be freeing up time anyway, and money.
Yeah, I mean, so I couldn't find myself disagreeing with any of that, and I think it's a crime that it's being leached away. Time is being leached away from clinicians, but it is, and so essentially, where we're at the moment is a climate in which people are looking for ways in which they can get the penny to drop, and in some ways cut corners when trying to elaborate to people as quickly as they can as to what might be going on and how, just trying to translate the fact that pain is more complex than the public perceive it. Now, is that something that you think that time and effort needs to be simply like it cannot be simplified to the point where our only option is to lobby for more time, or is it something that we can identify strategies in which we can cut some corners and find a way to get one of the lessers of two evils?
Yeah, I think and it won't surprise you, and again, I don't think it's the term we're just in discourse, but cutting corners was as a high risk element to me. It's when things are missed, it's when things are not always relied. So I think, how can we refine perhaps the message? Well, hopefully, again, for any managers listening, you want your more senior staff to have gone through that process where they've refined it. So they should be, require less time. The more junior staff need more time till they've refined that. So you're giving people a chance to refine it. So, not every diary in every department, in every practice should look the same to me. Your senior staff should have the flexibility to either have shorter or longer times. Your junior staff, your younger staff, in terms of therapeutic experience, should be given more time. It should be much more flexible. But most diaries, particularly electronic diaries, are set up that everyone has the same time with a patient, irrespective of expertise, irrespective of how long they've actually had to refine some of these sort of constructs they want to give across, the messages about pain, if you like, the teaching about pain. But I also accept that some of the senior staff are treating the much more complex people. So again, flexibility for them to have longer time to actually, to therapeutically and professionally choose the right amount of time they need for each person. And people say it's unworkable, but if you don't look at it, it'll never happen. And we are looking at it. Where I work, we're looking at that. We're doing something about it. We're trying to find a solution to those problems.
Yeah, there's been as part of this problem has emerged a thirst and hunger for clinicians that have seen a lot of patients and develop strategies in which they can find ways in the current climate. So myself included in that to some extent, for some strange reason, people interested in the ways in which I do that, and I go and do little workshops in which I just basically account for my take on certain things, but coming from a very non-academic place. As you know, a good friend of mine, Mike Stewart, someone whose views and styles in which you've had some sensible critique of. I wanted to just have your elaborate that a little bit, because it came up in Cause Health, it's come up with us off the microphone, but just as to, you've got some concerns over a clinician-centered approach to this refinement, this way in which we could maybe use things like imagery, stories, and elaborations that aren't necessarily anatomical, etc., to use with patients. And so, again, you think maybe that's oversimplicity?
Yeah, I think the first thing to state is I don't know Mike, and so it's not a personal issue with Mike at all, and
Sure.
not at all.
No.
But what it is an observation again, and again, this history we've gone through is where people are. We've got to be careful when we deliver, any of us as educationalists, of which I know Mike does see himself, and that's what academically he's pursuing, more the education line of things, obviously focused on pain, is that we have to also take on board what people hear, what people will do with the messages we give. My real issue is, number one, which I do think Mike does acknowledge, and we've had a bit of communication on Twitter about, is that actually anything, again, as I mentioned earlier, that therapeutically could be valuable, can have a positive effect, actually including metaphor and language and visual depiction. All of those things have the capability of making people worse as well as better. People would say maybe that's just a nocebo effect, and I think, again, that's throwaway in the same way they use placebo. So I think the other thing is that many of the people go on the courses and they're struggling for a language. That's why they on the course. So the easiest thing is to pick up the language, whether that's intended by Mike or my good friend Dave Butler, who's looked at these things over many years and has given some beautiful metaphor and some anecdotes. But Dave's a striny Australian who is a unique character, as I think you would tell me Mike is if I got to know him. And the language they use and have refined is part of who they are. And then when they go and teach it, it sounds strange for me to hear some of those things, and that Dave particularly says in an English accent, done in a way that is throwaway and slightly irreverent in an English setting, because we don't have that culture. Whether we should or not is another matter. And I've heard the same thing. I've heard people have been on one of Mike's courses, and they come back and they tell me the way that I should be doing things. Not necessarily me, but they tell me the way that we should be doing things. That this is what we should say. This is what we should use. And they're not personalising it either to themselves as a therapist or to the patient in front of them. And so this becomes sort of an academic sort of activity whereby I just learn the right things to say. It's a bit like the old-fashioned sort of way that we used to be taught, particularly in the MACP, when I first sort of started doing my MACP course of how we had to do a subjective in the same order, ask the same questions, we had to ask it in the same way, etc., etc.
When that sort of, sorry,
that's really alien for me, particularly as a sort of a working class bloke, when the majority of people in physio at the time, without any sexism, were middle class females. It wasn't going to be the language I wanted to use, and I think yeah, there's this disconnect between the intention of the educator and actually what and how people are using those tools when they're applied back to patients. That's what worries me.
All that can be, for me though, all that can be done in that circumstance is for it to be appropriately caveated and for that to be explained that this is a way in which you need to construct your own style and use the patient's own language and what the patient brings to it, and that therapeutic alliance you alluded to earlier. I can't think of ways in which any educator, Mike or otherwise, could do more than to just keep clarifying that and to keep trying to achieve it. Because if someone then goes and tries to translate it or copy and paste it, that surely falls at the fault of the learner, not the educator, if the educator has accounted for it, no?
Fault? No, we don't want fault. We're not in a blame situation.
I'm just that's me cutting corners, mate.
Yeah,
I was using that word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but I mean, equally, mate, we agreed. We were quite comfortable to sort of pick up where, I mean, I probably have given the impression of blame. I think, regardless of all that nonsense, I think that the point is that, again, so if I may be personal to me, not including anyone else, I've heard all sorts of things over the years, and many of them make me smile, and things like, Mick, we come on one of your courses and you don't teach us exactly what we want you to teach us at the end of it. All you've done is made us think. I think, well, as an educationalist, as an academic, as a scientist, that's sort of what it's dependent on me to do that, and I'm glad that I've done that. Has it been? So I asked them, has it been a waste of time? Not at all. I'm not saying that, and I'm not throwing that to put the pressure on them to somehow, massage my own ego. So we made them ask questions. Hopefully, I've given hundreds of references, but acknowledge they might not have the time. So try to give the key references, try to get them to read. I think what I'm really getting at here is, no, there's no fault. It's I still don't think we have a maturity in our profession where people are confident enough to really generate their own learning. If there's a course out there that they can do, then they'll go and do it. I'm not going to mention their names, but a few of your listeners will pick up. I've witnessed some very eminent, and in this case, overseas physios coming to this country, teaching SIJ courses and thoracic courses. And the day before they present the course, reading a osteopathic textbook that then they're going to present as knowledge the next day as their own. And the course that they're doing is costing 300 quid, and the book costs 52 quid. And, people will go because they've heard of the reputation, and they will hear their names, and they will feel that that's a course they need on their CV if they want to get ahead. And yet they could do that. And I'm not suggesting that anyone needs to buy an osteopathic book and learn about manipulating the SIJ or the thoracic spine, but I'm using it as an example. Same thing. I appreciate that many people find particularly pain incredibly challenging to understand, to get their heads around, particularly some of these sort of newer constructs, and this neurophysiology. It's a very different language, but they're putting a huge trust in the people who are delivering some of those courses to be accurately reflecting that science and that knowledge. And in some cases, I again, someone who some people out there will love Max Sussman. I taught a course with Max in London, and I was so excited to do that, and because I'd read his work and appreciated his work, but I'd had reservations, and anyone who knows me will know that. I think Philippa Tyndall described me recently on a podcast as having a bulgy edge, and some reluctance to just agree with authority figures, but I genuinely had some reservations. I was quite shocked Max's interpretation of work from someone who I'd worked in a lab with, but also at the same time I could see why, with all respect, him never having done an experiment ever at that sort of level involving some of those techniques, couldn't see actually the limitations or what something actually could tell you, and his over extrapolation, his over inference from some of that data, and more importantly his reluctance to be challenged by people who had actually been involved in some of that work, and several people in the audience, including myself, had, and almost the sort of godlike sort of way in which his word was held was really quite impacting, quite scary to me. So I think some of these experiences, personal experiences, have really sort of had a big impact, and I think having a healthy iconoclasm is a really important thing to take forward, but also not to be a pain in the arse. You've got to if they have done more than you, they've done more than you. But also remember, even in that case, people would always want to put their spin on it. They will want to give you the message they want to give. Will want you to take what they want you to take from it. Wow. And I think that's something you say. Do I do that? I actually would say to my own sort of credit or whatever, that's actually what I don't do, and that's where sometimes people have been disappointed when I've come on my course. I'd like to think not often, but people feel a bit frustrated. You're not giving us answers, you're giving us questions, you're challenging us to think about something, to do something in a particular way. And I'd hate for that to come across as arrogant, what I've just said, but I think those people who know me hopefully will recognize me pretty quickly in that. And that's not a cop-out for me trying to just make things too complicated. I think pain is complicated, and my biggest worry is when people try to simplify it. And if we went back to Mike, Mike uses a lot of Einstein quotes about if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it. And I think that has an element of truth, but it's also not true. I don't think anyone who listened to Einstein would particularly have thought it was easy. Richard Feynman would be my hero about how you transmit academic information. It's not easy.
But that's a great example you've used, is that he was very eloquent in how he was able to try and simplify the complex while still recognizing and elaborating its complexity. So he'd always sort of find himself walking into a corner and saying, I cannot explain this anymore, and unless I'm speaking to someone that can understand the next concept. So exactly. It's and so with that, when I've unfortunately not had a chance to go on your course yet. There's a day course that I know I missed out on, and hopefully I know there was talk of you maybe bringing that up to Liverpool, which would be fantastic. But I managed therefore to speak to people that had, and in doing so I was saying, well, I was watching the Twitter feed and it just had this sense that it was building to something. And so to be a bit of a pain in the arse, then it does. Whilst it is still, it's completely intellectually honest what you're suggesting. However, it is somewhat easier in a way to talk only of problems and to only infer towards solutions. So there's people that have to see an awful lot of patients now, not in the future. They're seeing patients now, and it's getting them down, and they're just trying to look for ways in which they can try and not just make their day easier, but make their patients' lives better, despite the fact that they're now only allowed 20 minutes for a follow-up. So that's happening. And so can we sort of try and find a way in which we can converge on the idea that offering up more questions is exactly how it should be, but also there can be a direction towards an answer, or a journey towards an answer, at least on a patient level. Maybe not necessarily between us, but for patients we sometimes will need to simplify it.
Oh yeah, look, I'm not about throwing and I hope that came out from our previous discussion when we did touch upon the clinical. That's not what I know we're not talking about that. It's not
No,
what,
I know, and that's not me. And that's not me suddenly trying to misrepresent
it's,
you. I just mean
completely different with therapists. I mean, I again, I was shocked in Cause Health. I think I had to add it in because I was shocked that I hadn't said it several times. But anyone who's done, longer MSc modules, they will know one of the things that they will associate with me is my question to them: how difficult's your job? And one of the really important things for me is to get across by asking people to think and consider these things, and to perhaps come to the idea there might not be a ready answer at the end of that. Is this idea that actually most people come, particularly to those post-grad courses, with this idea that they're doing something wrong and they're not as good as other people and they should know the answers. And they come and actually think, oh, I'm going to get them all from this. And then they realize, actually, hopefully, by looking at things in detail, that there aren't easy answers, that many people don't have the answers. And actually, they realize that their job is difficult and it's challenging. And actually, they can't have all the answers because no one can. And that it's okay not to know things, and it's okay to sometimes have to question and to reason through something rather than have the definitive answer up front. And I think that that's what I'm getting at. So I think that that's a necessary thing for clinicians to realise, actually, wow, I'm doing it. Hopefully, my real motivation is actually to make people feel better, not worse, not to sort of say, oh, I'm supposed to know everything that's going on here, by keeping asking questions and giving a direction. But if you asked me clinically, and I hope I showed that earlier, what would you do if, I would always give a straight answer to that, unless I felt I couldn't, unless I thought I was so compromised giving the answer that the person asking wants, as opposed to what I feel comfortable giving. I would always try to answer you, and those things are different. Those things are different. So, I think if people come to my courses, they often will ask. And this is no plug for courses. I don't do many, and I did when I was sort of coming through the ranks, if you like, and had the invitation to do it. I get lots of invitations, but I don't have the time, with commitment to research, commitment to sort of other things I'm involved in, and obviously my family, which are more important than anything to me, to take up all the offers. And, some of them are really nice. But you can also get seduced by that. You can get seduced by doing those things. You get seduced by the idea that people want to listen to you, and it can be damaging to your ego ultimately, So
it can be. I can imagine it. I can imagine it be alluring. I mean, we've danced there. I mean, I wonder now, looking at the time, we probably could have done a podcast on pain past, a podcast on pain present, and a podcast on pain future. And I definitely would. I think it'd be fantastic for us to reconvene on this part of the conversation around physio present and where we're at and where we can go. So I really do want, and I know the listeners are keen to hear your take on pain future, the direction in which we're going. I know that you're doing your second PhD with Andy Clark up in Edinburgh at the moment, investigating predictive processing. But in our conversations off the microphone, you have quite rightly elaborated on the fact that this doesn't necessarily mean it's the next frontier and this is exactly where we're at. You're keen to caveat it. So can you just tell the listeners about that work and also where you think we're going?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would really like to do up front is to say that, being an educator, you're really fortunate about some of the people you come across. So in this domain, a PhD student I shared with Lauren, we were privileged enough to have in our company for a period of time, would be a better way of saying it. Abby Tabor really was the one who initiated a lot of these ideas. So I've got a lot to thank her for it, and I hope she feels the same way reciprocally. But, Abby was the one who really sort of started to sort of get her head around Bayes, which is potentially a component. And I'm less Bayesian, if that's possible, within a predictive processing perspective, and much more about trying to say, well, look, we've got all this neuroscience that we've known about for years, and that hopefully my background has been in, and that I can understand. And if this is a potential new model, if this is a way that we can explain pain and help to understand pain better, is actually true, if this has got some construct validity, if you like, then it's got to be able to incorporate some of those other things. It's got to be able to incorporate central sensitization, phantom limb pain, CRPS. It's got to be able to incorporate the sort of more psychological perspectives too. And so that's really the work that I'm sort of engaged in trying to do with Andy Clark. And predictive processing is really about turning, if you like, your sensory system on its head and saying, well, actually, probably what you're doing is you're trying to model your expected sensory stimuli, and that will be dependent on where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're interacting with. But rather than waiting passively to receive a sensory stimulus, you are actually trying to predict what's going on out there. And a way to do that is to sort of construct models within the nervous system that are fed downwards from the sort of higher centers out towards the periphery, and then the peripheral signals either match or, if you like, a mismatch to that. And the thing that's actually transmitted in terms of the sensory signals are the errors between what's expected and what actually is occurring. So that's a very oversimplified perspective of predictive processing and the way they got into it. But it actually is more elaborate than that, in that, you know, I sort of saw it's got so many overlaps with the neural matrix sort of perspective. But what happened with the neural matrix is that actually the neuroimages are sort of largely responsible for turning it into an anatomical entity rather than the sort of anatomical and physiological entity that it was. But also Malzahn did base it heavily on some genetic predisposition, that he felt that the dominant aspect of the matrix was genetically sort of driven rather than sort of experience. Whilst acknowledging experience shaped it, it still was underpinned by this sort of genetic sort of construct, and that's not something that in terms of interacting with the world sat entirely comfortably with me. So I've been searching sort of since then and working with various people to look at a model. And you know, Pat Wall, for example, never really was a massive fan of the neural matrix, couldn't quite get his head around it for a number of reasons we perhaps don't have time to elaborate on. But one of them was the same, you know, it was driven more by some predeterminant from genetics than you know, actual people's day-to-day experiences. And there's lots of people who say I'm doing disservice to Malzahn, but I believe I'm not. You know, I think it's an incredible way to sort of generate these ideas. But predictive processing sort of came for me out of looking at the work of sort of Francesca Varela and Evan Thompson and Alva Noe and Kevin O'Regan and Susan Hurley and how all these other people have dealt with it more latterly, Colin Klein and some other philosophers, and really sort of settling on this as perhaps the best sort of construct we have at this present time. But I want to stress my PhD is about establishing whether it's actually a credible model. That's not, I'm going to confirm it is. I'm questioning whether it is. And at the end of it, I would love, and in fact, you know, anyone who's done a PhD will know that that's how you get one, that you add something new to that field of study. So I hope by questioning it, I can, you know, be involved in a modification or a correction or you know, support. But total support's unlikely, and that's not an agenda I'm setting out with.
Yeah, I think what's I mean, another podcast would be, I mean, if I could put the recorder in the middle of a table and me, ideal situation being me and you sat around with all the people you've just mentioned and talking about these factors as to where are the exceptions that break the rule, how does it map onto certain things. And because a lot of these things do lead to predictive processing started to make people feel uncomfortable when it started to tap into free will and where we are with that. And although I know we can't go there now, it is something for another time. Is that what I'm imagining? I've read in your writing is, could the bottom up be a correction of the prediction, and that's how those things interact. And how do you think that, unless I've just butchered that, please correct me, Rick, but is there a way in which we could scientifically test that in a robust way to know whether that is what's going on, and to confirm, disprove, or to move us on to something new? Is that what you're planning on trying to find out?
I think I just want to take one small backward step, because I think, but only because what you're highlighting really nicely, Jack, is what people's concerns are, their worries. I like the fact you've introduced that with, almost an element of sort of, there's a bit of threat going on here. What does it mean? If this is true, this turns everything on its head.
Yeah.
If I'm allowed to use a small expletive there, I've been really quite a good boy so far.
You've done well.
But I think what I would say is, it's not what is exciting about predictive coding for me. It's not either the periphery or the brain. It's actually this dynamic interaction between the two that actually, and what determines that in part is this construct of precision weighting, where we can fine tune either end or actually the components in between. And this is where sensitization fits into that. Sensitization may be actually just a mechanism by which precision weighting within certain parts of the nervous system are actually physiologically played out. So I think, precision weighting basically says you will give more or less, if you like, credence to a particular component of this system, so either to the prediction or to the error, so that you can fine tune which component it is. But I don't want you to think that error prediction only occurs at a particular center in the brain and then is fed down unaltered throughout the nervous system till it's the sort of dorsal ornal, wherever the sensory synapses are. This is actually hierarchically that every level above is predicting the level below, and every level below is giving potentially error signals to the level above to modify the model. And that's underpinned by classic neuroplasticity, classic neuroscience. That's the exciting bit for me, that I've already sort of, got enough insights to know that actually I don't have to give up on the stuff I learned about NMDA and calcium and GABA and glycine and substance P, etc. But what I might have to do is I might need to refine my terminology. So we've got this sort of descending modulation of pain is a good example, and I have on Twitter again sort of poked a couple of people for saying descending modulation of pain, because that suggests that what happens is that pain is constructed centrally and then we do something to deconstruct it peripherally. And what we're saying is, actually, if we think of this system as trying to make the best sense of the sensory world and the world in which the person is in, then actually, and when I say person now, I'm talking about the anatomical individual, and their thoughts and feelings as a construct of that in a material way. I think what we're really actually getting at is that there's no construction of pain to take it away. It's actually that's the best, and I am going to use the words, it's the best current guess for how to cope with the situation someone's in. So that would be not to allow sensory noxious information to reach the higher centers, that will be cancelled out before that occurs. And the mechanism to do that is just these descending pathways, but they're not descending pain pathways, because pain is a construct of the perception. So if we don't perceive it because we're doing something to actually modulate the error signals that would potentially then cause an updating of the model, which then gives us pain, then I hope you and the listeners are getting what I'm getting at. There's no response to being in pain is to get rid of it. Actually, the way to deal with the sensory world in which you sort of find yourself in, which in that case is then in some cases to actually make sure that the sensory signals don't actually ever get high enough to produce a pain experience.
Yeah. I think it's one of the hard things as well when talking this through, certainly for me, is that you can walk yourself into the wrong terminology because you suddenly find yourself describing pain as if it is some sort of traveling construct again, as if it's a traveling entity. As you mentioned, pain modulation. What is it that's being modulated, and that difficulty with the nomenclature, I think, stifles the conversation, especially something simplistic like Twitter. It can be clumsy at best, can't it? So these are these are the discussions that I would love to put to have going on in pubs up and down the country. I think that's exactly I'm a bit of a sad for that. I'd love for this to be over a few beers.
But again, I mean, you could say, because there's a couple of your listeners who at that point, because maybe I would be if I wanted to be cynical towards some of the things I'm saying, would say, well, you're at it again. You're sort of giving all this thing. What relevance does that have to the world? But what I'm saying is that if the prediction, if you like, if there is a chicken and an egg, if there is a starting point here, then the thought is that prediction, I mean, in actual fact, in the dynamics of predictive processing, this is a process that's cyclical, that, you're making prediction, you get an error, shapes the prediction, which shapes, what potentially will next be error or not be error, etc. I hope that makes sense. But so if we have ways to shape that prediction, and I believe we do behaviorally, thoughts, feelings, words. I mean, back to sort of Mike and Dave's and Byro's work and all the other people, Lakoff before them and Occur before that, in terms of, what do words mean? How do they impact? How do they shape the way in which, then in this case, in my terminology, predictions are made. There's a lovely paper, again, Andy Clark's one of the authors, with Lupyan, and I hope that's how you pronounce his surname, Lupyan, about how words are able to, construct and be part of the prediction, and actually how that may shape behaviour and how it may shape sort of motor activities. It's really quite a fascinating paper that I would urge people to read. So again, it's how we might interact with that, but it may be demonstrating to someone, they can do something safely, that they can move, so that, if we've got, it's interesting, we can apply this sort of predictive processing very easily to things like fear avoidance. If you keep demonstrating that you do an activity and it's potentially painful, that narrows the prediction. It makes it more and more likely that you will predict that a particular physical activity will give you a pain experience, and then it's more and more likely, because of this precision weighting effect, that in fact it will give you a painful outcome. So, I think this has got huge therapeutic, relevance. I think, and that's hopefully something that will really emerge over the next 4 or 5 years. And I know there's a lot of people on Twitter and social media quite interested in this, and great for their interest. But actually, there's a few of those people who are making it look like we understand this, and this is how we do it. Again, giving this very, this is what it is, this is what we understand from it, so this is what you do with it to clinically get people better in a very sort of linear, straight line, serial fashion. They seem to have the answers that, that are way beyond anything that I'm prepared to say, and that doesn't mean that I'm right and they're wrong, but I think they're almost sort of say, well, this is the next thing, jump on this, do that, find the literature to support it, which is what people have done, not engage directly in the work that is constructing that. So again, I would urge physios as well out there, and I think I said this at Choose Health, and I've said it over the years, is, ask people if you can do work with them. Eminent people generally won't say no to you if you do it in the right way and you demonstrate actually that you have an open mind. One of the reasons why I think a lot of physios are knocked back is they go in with their normal enthusiasm, which is great in many situations, but almost like they have the answer, and then people on the other side worry when you go with an answer, not go with a question or go with an inquiring mind, or as I've reflected, saying, well, I'm trying to establish whether it is a good model for pain, predictive processing. I don't know that still.
No, but then I for one, I'm excited for you to go and find out, and at least start a journey that others can take over from, and potentially it's certainly whet my appetite. And I'd love for us to chat further about how I can better understand it. So I know you're going to direct my reading, and I hope you can direct the reading of our listeners. So could you explain as to where you would direct people to prioritise their thinking if they're interested in these topics?
Yeah, I think I acknowledge it's complex, and that I hope it's not patronising, and I hope what I'm going to say next doesn't look as though I'm on a commission for Andy or promote Andy over the other great things. I mean, I think Andy's book Surfing Uncertainty, Andy Clark's book Surfing Uncertainty, is a fantastic place to start for several reasons. One, he's a very good communicator. He's demonstrates which he does have a fantastic sense of humour and a humanity which quite a few eminent scientists and philosophers don't always demonstrate, and I think he's carefully constructed it as well in a way that actually I think physiotherapists, physical therapists, people involved in movement will be particularly excited by, because there's a large component of it which involves active inference, which is not there in everyone's account. So I think Andy's book is a great starting point for those people who are turned on by that, for want of a better term. Obviously some of the research papers, some of his, but I would also urge them to look at Jacob Howie's book, The Predictive Mind, which I think is a book to read after Andy's book. Again, having said that, it's beautifully written. It's actually simple, but it's a slightly more technical book aimed at a slightly more technical audience, I believe. So that's a great place to follow it up. The other great name in this field currently is Carl Friston, but Carl's perspective slightly different. He's a theoretical neuroscientist, a very bright and very lovely man, but I think his work is quite theoretical, and he put forward a slightly different framework called the free energy framework, and that's a place to go perhaps once you feel comfortable with the terminology in Clark and a predictive mind. And then people want to go to a ready-made sort of paper or two, I would search out the work of Anil Seth, who again is a fantastic communicator. So in many ways his original papers are the simplest of all the sort of, if you like, technical papers to read. And I know I suggested you read one, so perhaps if there's a way of linking that or any of these references to the podcast, that would be great.
I can indeed, yeah. We'll put them. Make sure the listeners, if you haven't already, sign yourself up for the Physio Matters podcast newsletter, which will follow about 10 days, 2 weeks after this podcast.
Cool. And I mean, again, Anil is interesting that he has a slightly different perspective. So without getting too technical, he comes from a much more sort of cybernetic background to this, whereas the others are generally much more from a sort of Helmholtz sort of physiology of sort of sensory inference and processing in that sort of school. So it's quite nice to sort of have those. There's many others, but they're the four people who I think are the most accessible or interested, and obviously in Andy's case, someone I'm lucky enough to be involved in working directly with, and it's a privilege. So yeah,
no, that sounds awesome. Now, if we were to then think, what would you say would be a top things for people to read if they were to look at the podcast as a whole? If you think about pain, past, present and future, I'm struggling to spit that out, past, present and future as a whole, is that a perfect place to be plugging your mate Louis' series of books. I mean, it's a phenomenal piece of work that he put together.
Well, yeah. I mean, I suppose plugging. I don't want to seem like I'm plugging Louis' work. But plug-in, yeah, it's just the word. But of course, I think it's an exceptional piece of work, and I was privileged to sort of edit aspects of that work. I mean, read all of it, and obviously Philippa did the bulk of making those books into what they are in terms of what they look like and how they're constructed. But I was lucky enough to be able to give my opinion on every word, and but at times we agreed to disagree. But I think they're phenomenal. They're very personal, but they take people on a journey, through this sort of pain revolution. Highlights and details the work of some important people along the way, and gives due credit to people. But also for those people, again, just to highlight something that we talked about time. Remember, Louis was a private practitioner. He was dependent on his income from his private practice to look after himself. His wife worked with him as a physiotherapist, so I'm not going to say he looked after her, but people know what I mean by that. And to bring up two young kids who are now men. So he might not have had time. And also because he was a very keen golfer, fisherman, sailor, mushroom collector, taker of slightly psychedelic drugs in his early age, etc., etc. This guy was a rounded human being who wanted a life and had a great life and was a great character because of it. But he still found the time, and in fact actually found the time in the last 6 months of his life to write 450,000 words. But that's the writing bit. But he'd found the time in the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years plus to read, and to read at a level that most academics read at, which was really quite something. So to his credit. But I think it is possible, to combine being busy and a person and a professional with a life, with being able to try and get your head around some of these complex things. But hopefully what he would say, he had a lot of other people around him to knock ideas from to and fro, be able to criticise them and be criticised, and at the end of it, go down the pub and have a beer with. And I think, again, that's perhaps a nice place to finish, that that's the maturity we need more of in our profession, where just because we disagree, it's not personal, it's not nasty, it doesn't need to be. We can disagree and then love each other as human beings, and I would urge people to probably take that from my our podcast, if they can, rather than any of the other stuff. So
no, I think you're right. It's a lovely place to finish, because it's not just about, of course, Louis' brilliant work, but just take inspiration from him as a physiotherapist and as a man. I mean, it's incredible what he did in the life of his work. So we've got a lot to be inspired by, and not the least as well inspired by you, Mick. Thank you so much for your time. Can't wait to chat to you both on and off the microphone again in the future, but thanks for your continuing work, and I'm sure the listeners are going to really enjoy it. So thanks again.
Thanks, Gareth.
And so that brings to an end our two-part series, Pain, Past, Present and Future. Finally, I managed to spit that out. And I feel a little bit somber about it. I almost feel like it could be a 10-parter. I think we'd certainly have a bit of an attrition rate from the listeners if we made it that long. But I'd certainly still be interested, because there's a lot of Mick's brain I still need to pick. Sorry, I apologise. More of Mick's person I need to pick through. It was particularly interesting. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Please let us know at TPM Podcast on Twitter. I'm at choose_health, and Mick Thacker is under at DibbyGibby. We're also on Facebook, the Physio Matters Podcast. I'm not sure I've seen much of Mick on Facebook, but he certainly contributes a lot to the Twitter noise, so find him there. A few final thoughts from me regarding the podcast. Certainly listening back to this one today, and also the from what I recollect from the first one. There's a lot to think about and a lot of deep thinking that's required to sort of unpick these things. And I mentioned briefly in the podcast, and I think Mick did too, about just the importance of taking the time out to really develop yourself, develop how you construct thought, and thinking about what is it that counters your worldview most strongly. You know, what we all know the things that really feed into our biases, and we hope that echo chamber isn't being provided perfectly by Physio Matters. We hope we provoke different ideas within things, but one of the most important things with this is that there's a lot of it is counterintuitive, and we've got to understand that as best we can as practitioners and clinicians, because if it's counterintuitive to us, knowing what we know, just how strange is it to patients? And me and Mick disagree most, I think, on the pain present bit. You know, I just don't. What Mick describes as pain past and talks of as if it needs to be boxed and put in an archive or a museum, whilst I know he's not denying that that's still out there, I just personally find that to be so mainstream in the present, and I rarely encounter examples in which people are talking within the present outside of even there's only corners of Twitter even that really sort of live within what we talked about on this podcast as present. It's only a podcast, it's only one conversation, and I'm sure we could unpack it further, but that's where our disagreement lies, really, is more about what is the reality of right now. And talking within that, another area in which we don't, I feel, is certainly a conversation that needs to be at least attempted to be had again about what is the best way of us pragmatically going about trying to improve people's understanding of pain, or try and treat painful conditions and pain itself right now in the confines of where we're at in our current context. A few different angles that were taken, and we kept coming back to this question about how does that get delivered, not just to patients, but how can we inspire physios to take this on without trying to, I kept saying, cut corners, and Mick quite rightly picked me up and said, how can we refine it? I still find it an interesting disagreement that Mick has, or an interesting concern that Mick has with people like myself who try to find novel ways or interesting ways of just trying to get the penny to drop and then moving forward, sometimes swiftly due to time restraints that are very real within my working day. And I often talk about them in other contexts, off the podcast, in workshops, etc. So that's definitely something that we need to explore further. And if you share my view and analysis on that, then please speak up on social media, because I know full well that Mick will no doubt clarify things and offer more discourse to this conversation. So thank you so much for listening. As I've often mentioned, please do follow us and join us and support us, if you don't mind, on Patreon, which is patreon.com, Patreon, and support us if you can. Just a few quid will make all the difference. Don't like to be cap in hand in these moments, but it basically will make us fan funded and hold us to account for the content in which we produce, to keep it at a high quality, to sell ourselves out to you guys and to the profession and to the community that has developed around not just our podcast but other forms of social media and education, and then stop us selling out, as much as I don't like that term, to corporate entities and to pharmaceutical companies and other people that are wanting to throw money that we don't want to accept. So you've heard enough about Patreon. There is plenty other material out there, including soon to be more from Mick Thacker. So we've got a program in which we're delivering Cause Health conference videos that are they're on YouTube, and if you have a look on any of our social media streams, then you'll see videos from Cause Health coming up on a fortnightly basis on Fridays. So take a look at that. Most recently, Ronnie Anjum and Stephen Mumford's philosophy talks have just gone up, and I know they're going to prove popular when they catch fire. And we have, of course, Physio Natters, which is monthly, but kind of like the European Championships and World Cup in football. We try and have the Physio Matters podcast running the first Sunday of every month, and then I think it's 2 weeks after that we end up putting out Natters. And Jack March, Rob Tyre doing a fantastic job of that, but particularly worth a mention this month with an incredible episode that's super important on learning disabilities and how we can best serve that corner of our society, and a just brilliant, frank discussion on there that just clarifies a lot of questions that people have when they're in amongst a situation in which they know that they potentially services they should know about ahead of time that they don't, or how they can best communicate, or what even the policies and procedures are around that topic. So definitely please go and check that out, and Jack and Rob are popping that on Facebook as well as on YouTube, just because it seems to be more accessible for you guys. So please do have a little look. But that's enough from me this month. As usual, I'm waffling. And next month, I'm not going to tell you what we've got next because we're yet to decide. We've got a couple of things lined up in the pipeline, and a few episodes in the bank as well, for if we decide on those. So if you've got anything you particularly want to hear, then give us a shout, and we're always open to new ideas for episodes. But we've got a few things that we've got lined up, and I don't know what's going to come next, but all I can tell you and promise you is that it will be absolutely gold, because that's what we do. Clinical gold delivered direct, as arrogant as that sounds. But all that's left is for me to say, you've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing physio matters because physio matters.